This is Amy Laura Hall, and I am smirking because one of the jokes that people who are teaching online during the pandemic of 2020, 2021, one of the jokes we've been talking to ourselves about is that if you wait until the lighting is perfect and the sound is perfect, you'll never record a lecture. You'll never record anything. So here I am. I am going to give up on convincing my dog not to bark and trying to get the lighting just perfect. And I'm just going to go ahead and record. So this short, hopefully short, little conversation I'm going to have with people who are interested is specifically about why I teach about war the way that I teach about war. So I teach a course called War, Myth, and Masculinity for the Graduate Liberal Studies program at Duke University. I also teach a class called War and the Christian Tradition at Duke University Divinity School. I've also taught a class for the Science and Society program at Duke University on, what did we call it? Masculinity and technology in sports, sex, and war. So I, in various different ways, teach courses on war in the United States, and I teach in different programs across Duke University. I've been on faculty at Duke University since 1999, when I graduated from Yale University in 1999. December 1999 is when I officially received my PhD from Yale University Graduate School in Arts and Sciences in Christian Ethics. And my subfield, so my applied field in ethics, in religious ethics at Yale University, was in medical ethics. So my dissertation was on a philosopher, a Danish philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard, and I have other essays and short videos about my writing on Kierkegaard and why I wrote on Kierkegaard. But my applied field was medical ethics and continues in many ways to be medical ethics. As I was preparing to write and practice and teach in medical ethics, something I learned very quickly within the first year or so of working in medical ethics while I was a student at Yale University, I realized that my questions were, as some people would put it, very upstream from the questions of applied medical ethics. So that what I mean by this, and what people mean when they say that the questions are upstream, is that I was less interested in very specific medical technologies and whether or not those technologies were licit or illicit, whether or not those technologies were ethical or unethical. Those questions are really important, and I have written and I've published, I've spoken on specific technologies within the medical field, but I was more interested in questions that were prior to specific technologies. So questions about which technologies saw the light of day, which technologies were funded, which ideas, which companies were funding which ideas, and how people became convinced that certain technologies were worth their time, effort, money, use. And so my second book, my first book was on Soren Kierkegaard. My second book is called Conceiving Parenthood, and it is more of a cultural history of medical technologies than it is a book specifically in medical ethics. It was reviewed across lots of different journals, history journals, American Studies journals, Catholic ethics journals. My second book was reviewed in lots of different journals, including medical ethics journals, but it was not my attempt specifically to weigh in on particular technologies. Like I said, my questions were much more upstream, meaning up the stream from specific technologies. Now, I figured out also that because my questions were upstream, they were much more politically loaded even than very specific questions and answers within medical ethics. So there's a woman who has written on so many different things named Barbara Ehrenreich. And Barbara Ehrenreich, in one of her early publications on medicine and history in the United States, did a kind of twist on the term the military-industrial complex, which was a term first used by President Eisenhower. She used the phrase the medical industrial complex. And I realized early on that that's what I was trying to do, was just describe the medical industrial complex, not just looking at pharmaceutical advertisements, but also looking at Disney propaganda videos from the 1950s, looking at General Electric advertisements, looking at Ladies' Home Journal, continuing into the present and thinking about the ways that families are depicted on television shows. So my second book has lots and lots of pictures. You can get quite a bit out of just looking at the book on Google Books. Getting now to why I teach war the way that I teach about war is that I found that very specific questions about particular technologies I'm using passive voice right now, the ways that different branches of the military, ways that different decision makers within the United States were using particular forms of warfare. Those questions are very important. And there are people who write and teach primarily about those particular technologies. I have written and spoken, and I continue to teach on how particular technologies become mainstreamed, how particular technologies become just a part of what is considered normal. So most recently, my writing has been on torture. One of my essays is on torture and television in the journal Muslim World, which you can look up. If you look up my name, Amy Laura Hall, and torture and television, that should come up. So, and I just finished an encyclopedia essay, an entry, it's a long entry on torture for the Wiley-Blackwell Encyclopedia of Religious Ethics. And in my teaching on war, rather than focusing in on particular practitioners who were expected by their superiors to torture people, I am interested in helping people ask questions about how torture became a practice that seemed reasonable within the United States. So that's one way in to explaining why I teach about war the way I teach about war. Another way to talk about this is that I found early, this would have been 1997 or so, 1997, somewhere I could find exactly the date, but the Society of Christian Ethics has an annual meeting every year. It's a big meeting with lots and lots of ethicists who come and discuss all sorts of different things. And I'm pretty sure it was at the Society of Christian Ethics meeting Yeah. Yeah, it was, because I can remember who all was there. So the Society of Christian Ethics had a session on pacifism, on nonviolence, on pacifism, and two of the main speakers, they may have been the main speakers, well, at least one of the main interlocutors was Glenn Stassen. So John Howard Yoder was a main speaker, and Glenn Stassen was at least an interlocutor. He might have been a respondent. But you can look up who Glenn Stassen was, Stassen, and you can look up who John Howard Yoder was. And these two men who both who both wrote about pacifism within Christianity in the United States, both of them ended up in an argument. This was, again, around 1997, I believe. I was in the room and I was taking note that this was a very impassioned argument between two men who are pacifists, and they were arguing very specifically about how to make the case for pacifism. And Glenn Stassen was making the case that it is important to make the case for pacifism using arguments that relate to efficacy, meaning that it is important for people who work within peace studies, who work within pacifism in the United States, it's important to talk about how effective pacifism can be. And John Howard Yoder was arguing back that efficacy is not the primary way to talk about pacifism. Specifically, he was making the argument that Christians shouldn't measure in any way the efficacy of pacifism, that it's a category error to measure the efficacy of a Christian witness for peace. So these two men were having an argument that people were taking very close note of in the room about how to have a conversation about pacifism in the wider public. So they were having a conversation at this academic meeting about what often people would call being a public intellectual, more specifically being a public Christian ethicist who people listen to. Now, you can look up more presently about John Howard Yoder's legacy. There were many people who studied with him. He's no longer living on this earth. He also was, I think very clearly, he was alleged to and found very clearly to have been sexually abusive towards people over whom he had power. And there have been all sorts of conversations about how to consider his legacy, given that his life was not one of nonviolence. And Glenn Stassen is also no longer with us. At the time, I did not know that Glenn Stassen's father, Harold Stassen, I believe that's right, I wrote about him, for goodness sakes. Harold Stassen's, I think that's his first name. I would have to look it up for sure. But Harold Stassen, I think that's right in terms of his first name, was the head of Eisenhower's ATOMS, ATOMS, Atoms for Peace campaign. Glenn Stassen, who was arguing with John Howard Yoder at this academic meeting, was very clearly, I think this is very fair to say, very clearly invested in the efficacy of pacifism as an argument in the public sphere. So he was very interested in convincing people who were making decisions about the military and about the use of the U.S. military, about the use of atomic weaponry. He was interested in having those conversations, and he was interested in figuring out ways to be more effective in those conversations. So that academic meeting, when I was, let's see, I was born in 1968, so do the math. I was a young scholar at that time, and I remember watching these two men, knowing that their conversation really mattered, then processing some of what I learned later and thinking about how most of what I'd learned up until the point when I came to specialize in Christian ethics, most of what I learned about politics, most of what I learned about American history, had very little to do with the kinds of conversations that Christian ethicists were having about pacifism. It is also the case that I was finding already at that time as a Christian ethicist that people who were making decisions about national policy were not so much interested in the finer points of what's called just war theory as they were in convincing the American public generally through popular forms of entertainment and the news that certain techniques within warfare were necessary, were ethically necessary for some greater good. So I could give a whole lecture on just war theory, and there are people, if you want, you can, I'm sure the Wikipedia page actually for just war is outstanding. I'd be very surprised if it weren't thorough and very helpful. But what I was already thinking about Christian ethics as I was entering the field was, this is a conversation that seems to be separate from what's actually happening in the world of geopolitics. And I wasn't interested in reproducing a conversation that it seemed to me, I'm going to risk using this word, I've used it before, it seemed to me the conversation was a boutique one, meaning it was a conversation that was happening among people who were listening to one another, arguing with one another, sometimes very incisively, sometimes very analytically very clear ways. I still teach some of those texts every time I have students who need to learn about military ethics, but the conversations are isolated to a particular field, and they are not, those conversations are happening maybe in some military academies. I have been told by students that conversations about what constitutes a just war are, that people are having those conversations. But in terms of what's actually happening in geopolitics, those aren't the conversations that I have found to be the most powerful conversations, and the ones that I think are most important and hidden from the field of ethics. So a long time ago, I was sitting in on a class that Stanley Hauerwas was teaching. So this, for those of you who aren't in Christian ethics, you might not even know who he is. That's fine. You don't have to. He is, I think, officially retired now at Duke University, but he was the senior Christian ethicist here for most of my career at Duke. And before I came to be his colleague, I sat in on a class with him. I don't even remember what year it was, maybe around 1994 or so. And it was a class on war. It was a seminar, and I was visiting as a new scholar, prospective student at Duke. And what he said to that small room of students, it was PhD students mostly at the time, was that the most important thing a Christian ethicist can do is to teach about how people lie. he has written, Stanley Hauerwas has written about this, that the most important thing, Stanley has a tendency, as I'm sure as heck do this myself. The most important thing is this, and it could change depending on the situation, but he has written in various different places that it is crucial for a Christian ethicist to teach about how people with power lie and to call out those lies as they have the capacity to do so, as they have a voice to do so. That is also why I teach about war the way I teach about war. I teach about how myths become truth. I teach about how different myth makers create myths. I teach about how cigarette advertisements helped convince men to make a decision between working in a coal mine and signing up to go be a part of the US military. I am less interested in calling to account particular members of the military and more interested in thinking about how stories about US policies become common sense, even those that are not even remotely true. So another story that plays into this is that early on when I was teaching at Duke University in Christian ethics, large Christian ethics class, I was teaching a section on, I think we were talking about atomic weaponry at that point in class, and some students asked me, well, wasn't it absolutely necessary that we drop the atomic bombs, that the United States use atomic weaponry in the War of the Pacific, specifically dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because after all, the United States had to save the people who were being slaughtered in the concentration camps. And the vast majority of the students in that class, and I think this was when I was teaching the class with about 160 students in it, the vast majority of students in that class thought that the United States had entered World War II specifically in order to save people who were being killed, who were horrified, to save people from the Holocaust. That is what most of the students thought in terms of US history, which is not true. And I stood there as their professor trying to explain that that wasn't the case. And some of them thought that I was denying that the Holocaust had happened. And that wasn't at all what I was trying to say. I was trying to explain that the history is much more complicated than that, and that the United States went into World War II for many different reasons, but the US population did not know that the Holocaust, did not know that the German government was committing this horrifying atrocity during World War II. Students didn't know that. So around 2000, 2002, around that time, 2002, 2003, somewhere around that time, I realized I was going to be needing to teach history. As I was teaching Christian ethics, I was going to need to also teach US history. So that's another reason why I teach about war the way I teach about war, is I am doing double duty at least. I am teaching about warfare and teaching about US history and teaching cultural history and teaching about gender. So there is another route in, another way into the conversation about why I teach about war the way I teach about war. I grew up in West Texas. I know quite a bit about men who went off to war. I know quite a few stories about young men, teenage boys, who made decisions about what they were going to do in order to try to have enough money to be trained in a profession, to be trained in a trade, to some of them go to college. And I, from early on, had no illusion that the United States is gender neutral. I don't even know what it looks like to have a conversation about history, warfare, and United States policy without bringing gender and race into play into the conversation. So that is another reason why I teach about war the way I teach about war, is because I have to also introduce many students to the fact that many of our myths that we have within the United States are racially coded and gender coded, meaning COD. That our myths have very clear relationships to the color of people's skin and to what particular anatomy people have. Stanley Hauerwas taught in a particular way as a man from East Texas. As a woman from West Texas, I have to do a kind of ambassadorial diplomatic task to try to convince students who think that a woman won't know anything. Well, in general, I have students who think that a woman won't know anything. Yeah, that's a whole other lecture to give, but lots of stories on that one since 1999. But I have students who are female, I have students who are male, I have students who are black, I have students who are white, I have lots of different kinds, how awkward, sorry, students who don't think that a woman who hasn't been in the military they don't think that I should be teaching about war at all. What do I know? It has something to do with my being a woman. I have no doubt about that. For some of them, at least, it has something to do with my being a woman. So I have to do some ambassadorial work trying to convince at least some of the students who take my classes that I have something to teach and that I have something to teach them about war. And now I'm going to say finally two other things, and then I'll stop before the dogs start barking again. So years ago, in teaching a class, this specific class, War and the Christian Tradition, two of the men in the class, and I don't have permission to say their names, so I'm not going to say what year it was, I'm not going to give more specifics, but two of the men in the class who were at the time currently in the military said to the class something like, it's no fun, it's not fair even being in this class having to defend the policies of the U.S. military as people who are active within the U.S. military. What I was realizing was that students who are currently in the military were finding themselves, not all of them, but some of them felt like they had to defend even policies that were made before they were born. And one of those students said, in the future, you need to teach about policies that are implemented by the State Department. Do not just teach about the Pentagon, which I wasn't, but I mean, he was making a very clear case. You need to teach about policies that are implemented under the auspices of the State Department. You need to be talking about policies that are implemented outside of the Pentagon, and you need to be teaching even more about American culture. I'm paraphrasing him there, but I promised him after that semester was over that I was going to change the syllabus, and I did change the syllabus to focus even more on questions related, on upstream questions, on questions that, to use another metaphor, are more radical. Radical meaning at the root, digging into what counts as war, digging into what created, who created the phrase war on drugs, for instance. So I made a promise to a former student that I'd change my syllabus, and I'm glad I did. I also have, this is the last story, I also have had one, it was only one, but I have had one military chaplain in one of my classes during the class say that only people who had been through war can have any idea about how to teach about ministering to people who have been through war. At that point in my teaching, I had been teaching for about over a decade, I'll put it that way. I had been teaching for over a decade. I had also been a pastor. I am a United Methodist ordained minister. I had been teaching people who had been through war. I had also been a pastor to people who had been through war. I also have taught people who've been through other horrible traumatic experiences. I have taught people who are surgeons. I have taught people who have in other parts of their lives been firefighters. I've taught people who are currently working as volunteer firefighters. I've taught people in all different walks of life. I've ministered with and to people who have been through many different life experiences that I've never had. If it were the case that only someone who has lived through war can teach people how to minister thoughtfully, attentively with people who've been through war, then there are many people teaching who shouldn't be teaching, and I don't think that it's true. What I ended up saying the session after this student said that in class, what I ended up saying is that I have not found that to be true. I have found in my experience that my teaching has actually been helpful to people who have previously been in the military and who are serving in some way to think alongside, to care for others alongside people who are currently in the military and who have been in the military. So that's another reason why I teach the way I teach. I teach questions and texts, films and words on a page that over 21 years of teaching I've found have been helpful to people who are dealing in multiple different ways with the United States policies regarding the military, regarding war, regarding violence, and that's in about a 40 or so, 34-minute mini lecture, an explanation for why I teach war the way I teach war. As a postscript, I will say that if you are hearing this video because you're enrolled in one of my classes with war in the title, and you need, for whatever reason, to focus on a particular set of questions within military ethics, within the ethics of chaplaincy, within the ethics of particular things related to warfare, yeah, I could keep going, but if you have a particular set of questions that are important for your service, I will absolutely create with you, alongside you, with what I can glean from my previous teaching and also from other colleagues I have who I listen to carefully at other institutions in other fields. I will help you compile a syllabus, pull together a syllabus for a course alongside the course you're also taking with me, so that you can meet whatever needs that you find are the case for you in your particular line of service, in your particular line of ministry. So my syllabus is, I've put together my syllabus with wisdom, and I also am always open to adding items to the syllabus for people who are needing their degree to be trained in a particular way. So I won't keep going on that one. Hopefully those of you who need to understand what I'm saying, understand what I'm saying. And if you don't, you can email me. And if I don't email you back, you can email me again and remind me that I need to respond. Okay, blessings. It is January 7th, 2021, and hopefully we will all be able to see one another at less than 6 feet soon.